The last thing my mother ever called me in public was a defect. She said it at my sister's wedding, standing beneath crystal chandeliers in front of 200 guests, while a violin played somewhere behind us and waiters pretended not to hear. "What is she doing here?" my mother asked, staring at me over the rim of her champagne glass. 9 years without a phone call. 9 years without a birthday card. And that was her first sentence. What she didn't know was that before the night ended, a secret my family had buried for a decade would come crashing down in front of everyone they had spent their lives trying to impress. But to understand how we got there, you have to go back 10 years, to a hallway lined with medical diplomas and one empty frame that was supposed to belong to me. My name is Grace Whitfield. I'm 28 years old, and in my family, love was never something you received. It was something you earned. The hallway in my parents' house looked like a museum. Framed degrees covered the walls: my grandfather's medical license, my father's fellowship, my mother's awards, my sister Vivian's certificates. Every achievement had its place. Except for one frame. The 12th frame hung at the bottom of the wall, completely empty. I was 14 when I finally asked my mother about it. "What goes there?" I asked. She didn't even look up from her paperwork. "Yours," she said calmly. "When you've done something worth remembering." That sentence followed me for years. Every Sunday night, our family sat around the dinner table, and my mother asked the same question. "What did you accomplish this week?" Vivian, my older sister, always answered first. Highest score in chemistry. First place in the science fair. Accepted into another honors program. Everyone smiled. My father raised his glass. My mother looked proud. Then their eyes turned to me. And suddenly, the room became very quiet. I wasn't the brilliant daughter. I wasn't the future doctor. I was the girl who volunteered at nursing homes, stayed late to help elderly patients, and spent afternoons taking care of my grandmother. In my mother's world, kindness wasn't an achievement. It was a consolation prize. Then came my high school graduation, the night I finally understood exactly where I stood in my family. My parents rented the country club's garden room. 22 relatives filled the tables. White roses covered every corner. For the first hour, I actually believed the dinner was for me. Then my mother stood up and tapped her glass. "I have exciting news," she announced. The room fell silent. "Vivian has been accepted into medical school with a full scholarship." The guests erupted into applause. My father stood and raised a toast. My aunts cheered. Conversations exploded across the room. Meanwhile, my graduation cake sat untouched in front of me. A waiter quietly placed a slice on my plate while everyone celebrated my sister's future. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I understood. Then my mother tapped her glass again. "And of course," she said, smiling in my direction, "we should say something about Grace." Every face turned toward me. My stomach tightened. "One daughter inherited the Dixon brilliance," my mother said, lifting her glass toward Vivian. Then she looked at me and smiled. "And the other inherited different gifts." A few relatives laughed nervously. Someone looked down at their plate. I sat there holding my fork, staring at my cake, praying for the floor to open beneath me. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone in the hallway, staring at the empty frame. My mother walked over and tapped the glass with one finger. "In this family, love is earned," she said quietly. I looked at her for a long moment and finally found the courage to say the words I'd been hiding for years. "I'm not going to medical school." For the first time that night, her smile disappeared. "Then that frame may stay empty forever." She turned and walked upstairs. A few minutes later, the back door creaked open. My grandmother Ruth stepped onto the porch carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She sat beside me, removed the old nurse's watch from her wrist, and fastened it onto mine. Then she squeezed my hand and whispered something that would haunt me for the next 10 years. "Grace, your mother never learned what love really is." 10 months later, my family would throw me out of the house. And that unfinished sentence would become the only thing keeping me alive. The morning my parents took away my future, my father spread the paperwork across the kitchen table as calmly as if he were discussing the weather. "The college fund has been reassigned," he said, keeping his eyes on the folder in front of him. I stared at him, certain I had misunderstood. "What do you mean, reassigned?" Before he could answer, my mother stepped into the room, coffee cup in hand. "Vivian's medical school tuition is expensive, Grace. The money should go where it'll actually make a difference." She said it so casually that, for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. $80,000. For years, I had believed that money belonged to my future. I wasn't planning to become a doctor, but I had dreams of nursing school, of building a life where helping people actually meant something. My mother didn't care. In her mind, investing in me was like throwing money into the ocean. I looked at my father, hoping, desperately hoping, that he would say something, anything. He didn't. Instead, he folded his hands and quietly said, "Your mother and I think this is the best decision." That was the moment I understood something that would take me years to fully accept. My father wasn't trapped in my mother's world. He had chosen it. For months, I had been preparing for this possibility without admitting it to myself. I'd opened my own bank account, hidden my important documents, and taken night classes to earn my nursing assistant certification. Deep down, I already knew what was coming. The ultimatum arrived 2 weeks later. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. My mother stood at the bottom of the stairs while my father remained silently behind her. "You still have time to fix this," she said. "Fix what?" "Quit your nursing job. Retake the entrance exams. Follow the path this family expects from you." "And if I don't?" She crossed her arms. "Then you can leave." The words hit me harder than I expected, not because they surprised me, but because of how easily she said them. Leave. As if she were asking me to take out the trash. I looked at my father one last time. He lowered his eyes. That hurt more than anything my mother had ever said. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then I nodded. "Okay." My mother blinked. I don't think she expected me to agree. I walked upstairs, pulled 2 old trash bags from the closet, and started packing. Shirts. Jeans. My nursing certificate. The small savings I'd hidden in a shoebox. And Ruth's watch. 40 minutes later, I stood by the front door with everything I owned hanging from my shoulders. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody said, "Don't go." My mother opened the door and looked at me with complete certainty. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." For the first time in years, I looked directly into her eyes. "No," I said quietly. "I'm making my first decision that you don't get to grade." For a second, the entire house fell silent. Then I stepped outside. Behind me, the porch light went dark before I even reached the sidewalk. I stood there in the rain, 19 years old, carrying my life in trash bags, with nowhere to go. And somehow, that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing that a small piece of me still hoped someone would run after me. Nobody did. I walked 3 blocks before I finally sat down at a bus stop and looked at Ruth's watch wrapped around my wrist. For the first time all night, I cried. What I didn't know then was that losing my family was only the beginning. Because over the next 9 years, I would build something they could never imagine. And one day, the same people who threw me out would stand in front of me, pretending they had never done it. The first apartment I ever lived in sat above a laundromat that never seemed to sleep. At 19, I spent my nights listening to washing machines rumble through the floor and wondering if my parents had already turned my bedroom into something else. A guest room, maybe. An office. Anything that proved I had never really belonged there. During the day, I worked as a nursing assistant for $11 an hour. The job wasn't glamorous. I helped elderly people bathe, changed bandages, carried groceries, and listened to stories they had already told me a dozen times. My mother used to call it cleaning up after strangers. But she was wrong. I wasn't cleaning up after strangers. I was protecting their dignity. My first client was an 84-year-old widower named Mr. Alger. Arthritis had twisted his hands so badly that he couldn't button his own shirt anymore, but he still insisted on wearing a tie every morning. One afternoon, as I helped him fix the collar, he looked at me and asked, "Did anyone ever tell you that you're too kind for your own good?" I laughed. "Mostly, people tell me I'm not ambitious enough." He studied my face for a moment. "Funny," he said quietly. "The people who say that are usually the ones who don't know what ambition really looks like." I thought about those words for days. Because every night, after my shifts ended, I sat in my tiny apartment with a notebook and wrote down everything that frustrated me about the home care system. Families waiting hours for callbacks. Patients forgotten between shift changes. Caregivers treated like machines instead of people. Page after page, I filled that notebook with ideas. At first, I told myself it was just a habit. But deep down, another dream had already begun to grow. Then, 3 years after my family threw me out, the phone rang. It was Ruth's neighbor. Her voice sounded strange. "Grace, your grandmother had a stroke." For a moment, everything around me disappeared. "What hospital?" she told me. I left work early and drove nearly 3 hours without stopping. The entire way, I kept telling myself the same thing. She's waiting for me. She has to be. But when I reached the hospice center, the receptionist looked down at her clipboard and frowned. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Only immediate family members are allowed." "I am family," I whispered. "I'm her granddaughter." The woman checked the list again. My name wasn't there. I stood in that lobby wearing my scrubs, staring at the paper in her hands, slowly understanding what had happened. My mother had erased me again. Even now. Even here. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, staring up at the building, wondering which window belonged to Ruth. 11 days later, she was gone. Nobody called me. Nobody told me about the funeral. I found out 2 days after it was over. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened the last voicemail Ruth had left me. "Gracie, it's your grandmother. Don't you dare delete this." Tears filled my eyes before she could finish the sentence. I stopped the recording after 12 seconds. For 5 years, I would never listen any further. But losing Ruth changed something inside me. 6 months later, with $12,000 in savings and a notebook full of ideas, I signed the lease on a tiny office and started my own company. I called it Brightwater. What I didn't know was that one phone call, just a few years later, would connect me to the very family that had spent nearly a decade pretending I didn't exist. The office I rented for Brightwater was so small that if 2 people stood up at the same time, someone had to move. One room held a desk, 2 folding chairs, and an old coffee machine that worked only when it wanted to. The other room stored paperwork and supplies. It wasn't impressive, but for the first time in my life, something belonged entirely to me. Every dollar I had was invested in that tiny office. During the day, I answered phones, interviewed caregivers, and visited patients. At night, I sat alone under fluorescent lights, balancing accounts and wondering whether I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. There were weeks when I slept on the office couch because gas money mattered more than comfort. But slowly, things began to change. Families started recommending us to friends. Hospitals called us back. Caregivers stayed because, unlike other agencies, I treated them like human beings. I had only one rule. Take care of people when they're at their weakest. Everything else came second. 3 years passed. Then one Tuesday morning, St. Anne's Regional Hospital called. "We have a difficult case," a woman explained over the phone. "Every agency we've contacted has turned it down." "Tell me about the patient." "An elderly teacher with a severe spinal injury. A complicated home situation. Endless medical needs." Before I could answer, another voice came onto the line. Calm. Confident. "This is Dr. Daniel Whitfield." That single conversation changed my life. He expected to meet another business representative carrying brochures and promises. Instead, I walked into the hospital conference room wearing scrubs and carrying years of experience. For the next 20 minutes, we argued about discharge plans. "You can't send him home without overnight care," I said. "We don't have the resources." "Then make resources." Daniel stared at me for a few seconds, then unexpectedly smiled. "You always this stubborn?" "Only when patients are involved." The invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 3 weeks before I finally agreed to go. Daniel never pushed me. Every time I picked up the envelope and put it back down, he simply asked the same question. "Are you going because you want closure, or because you're still hoping they'll change?" I never answered him. Because the truth was, even after 9 years, a small part of me still believed that maybe my mother would look at me and finally see her daughter instead of her disappointment. I was wrong. The ceremony itself was beautiful. White flowers lined the aisle, a string quartet played softly in the background, and 200 guests smiled as if they were watching the beginning of a perfect story. Then the reception started. Daniel and I found our seats at table 2, close to the bride and groom. I thought it had to be a mistake. Apparently, so did my mother. From across the ballroom, I watched her stare at the seating chart, then back at me, confusion spreading across her face. For the first time in years, she didn't know who I was anymore. A few minutes later, the groom's mother, Dr. Susan Holston, walked over and smiled warmly. "Grace Whitfield?" she asked, extending her hand. "Eric has told us wonderful things about Brightwater." Before I could answer, my mother froze. Brightwater. She had never heard the name before. For 9 years, she had never once asked what happened to me after I left home. Not once. The speeches began. My mother stood first, raising her glass proudly. She talked about tradition, achievement, and family honor. She spoke about success as if it were the only thing that gave a person value. Then the groom, Eric, stood up. He smiled toward Daniel and pointed at our table. "I want to thank 2 people who changed my life." The room became silent. "The first is my mentor, Dr. Daniel Whitfield." Applause filled the ballroom. "And the second is the woman who funded the fellowship that allowed me to become the doctor. Grace Whitfield, founder of Brightwater and granddaughter of Ruth Chase. Would you please stand?" 200 people turned toward me. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then my mother's face lost all color. Vivian stood frozen beside her new husband. And suddenly, the story my family had spent 9 years controlling began to collapse. "There's been a misunderstanding," my mother said quickly. But Eric looked at her in confusion. "Vivian told us she was an only child." The silence that followed was unbearable. Nobody knew where to look. Not at me. Not at my mother. Not at the bride standing in the middle of her own wedding, realizing that the truth had finally caught up with her. A few minutes later, my mother followed me into the hallway. For the first time in my entire life, she stopped pretending. "Come home," she whispered. "Come back for Christmas. Come back for Thanksgiving. We can fix this." Then she said the words I had wanted to hear since I was 14. "The frame is yours now. You've earned your place." I looked at her for a long moment. For years, I had dreamed about that moment. For years, I thought acceptance would heal everything. But standing there, wearing my grandmother's watch, I finally understood something she had tried to teach me all those years ago. Love isn't a prize. It isn't something you earn. And people who make you compete for it were never offering love in the first place. I gently took my mother's hands and lowered them. "No," I said softly. "The frame can stay empty." Then Daniel took my hand, and together we walked out through the front doors. Not the side entrance. Not the kitchen. The front doors. Exactly where I belonged. Later that night, sitting in the car, I opened my phone and played my grandmother's voicemail all the way to the end for the first time. And through my tears, I heard the words that changed my life forever. "Nobody earns love, sweetheart. Real love is given freely.